The galaxy had always been a place of rules and order, carefully maintained by the Intergalactic Council. For centuries, civilizations had worked together under the Council's guidance, making decisions that affected countless worlds. Humans had been part of this system for a relatively short time, but they had made their presence felt in ways no one had expected. While other civilizations often followed rules quietly and without question, humans had a way of speaking up, asking difficult questions, and refusing to accept ideas that didn't make sense to them. Some council members admired them for their courage, while others considered them reckless, unpredictable, even a little annoying. Life in the council's chambers seemed calm to outsiders. The halls were filled with beings from countless worlds, each with their own shapes, voices, and traditions. Some had translucent skin that glowed softly under the council lights, while others moved with mechanical precision. Each representative spoke in the language of the council, a carefully crafted system designed to be fair and neutral. To an untrained eye, everything appeared orderly. Discussions flowed in a predictable rhythm. Proposals were debated, votes were cast, and compromises were reached. But beneath this surface of civility, tension simmered, and humans had begun to notice things that disturbed them. The first sign of trouble came during a debate over resource distribution. Several civilizations were asking for more than they had a right to, while smaller worlds struggled to maintain basic supplies. Humans had listened quietly at first, observing patterns in how the council handled these disputes. They noticed favoritism, delays, and rules that seemed to exist only to protect the powerful. Some council members shrugged off these observations, believing that the humans would eventually conform to tradition. But humans had never been known for conformity. They raised questions in calm but firm tones, asking why certain planets received more than others, why emergency resources were redirected for political gain, and why warnings from smaller civilizations were often ignored. Their questions were not aggressive at first. Humans wanted clarity, fairness, and transparency. They suggested solutions that were practical, drawing on their experience managing conflicts on their own home planet. Other council members listened politely, then dismissed the ideas. They told the humans that their perspective was interesting, but that tradition could not be changed. Some laughed when humans proposed direct accountability for those who mismanaged resources, claiming it was unnecessary. This dismissal planted the seeds of frustration in the humans' minds. They could see how small injustices, when left unchecked, could grow into larger problems. They could sense the council's slow decay beneath a facade of order. Over time, humans began to prepare quietly for a response. They did not act rashly. They did not shout or protest immediately. Instead, they studied the council's routines, observed how decisions were made, and noted the weaknesses that could be exploited if necessary. They spoke to each other in private, discussing strategies, possible outcomes, and ways to make their point without causing irreversible damage. Their conversations were calm but urgent. They knew that once they acted, there would be no turning back, but they also understood that sometimes action was the only way to make others listen. Humans were not the only ones noticing tension in the council. Other civilizations began whispering among themselves about the humans' unusual behavior. Some envied them, admiring their courage to question authority. Others were worried, sensing that humans might disrupt the careful balance that had been maintained for centuries. Despite the whispers, most council members continued their routines, too absorbed in their own agendas to notice the slow buildup of human dissatisfaction. They assumed that humans, like every other species before them, would eventually follow the rules without question. This assumption would soon prove to be a critical mistake. Days turned into weeks, and the humans continued to participate in council sessions with a quiet intensity. They spoke less about small issues and more about systemic problems. They highlighted areas where the council had failed to act, showing the consequences of inaction. Each time a human raised a point, other members of the council nodded politely, but failed to make changes. It was as if they were trapped in a cycle of politeness and bureaucracy, unable to address the real concerns before them. Humans, however, were not trapped. They observed, they calculated, and they prepared. One evening, after a particularly long day of debates, a group of humans gathered in a private chamber. Their faces were serious, their voices steady. "We've tried to work within the system," one of them said. "We've spoken up, given solutions, and pointed out flaws. But nothing changes. If we continue like this, nothing will ever change." Another human nodded, adding, "We need to make them see the consequences. We can't keep being part of a system that ignores fairness, truth, and the well-being of every civilization equally." There was no anger in their voices, only determination. They knew that their next steps would be decisive, and they prepared to act with precision. The humans' plan was not about rebellion or chaos. They did not want to destroy the council or harm anyone. Their goal was to demonstrate the importance of their presence, to show that the council could not function effectively without them. They wanted the other civilizations to recognize that humans had value, not because of strength or power, but because of vision, integrity, and the courage to act when others would not. This was a quiet, calculated form of protest, designed to make a statement without violence. Meanwhile, council members continued with their routine, oblivious to the humans' silent preparations. They discussed new proposals, argued about policies, and occasionally glanced at the humans, noting their focused expressions. But no one suspected that humans were on the verge of walking away completely. Humans had always seemed adaptable, capable of compromise, and willing to participate. It was hard to imagine them taking such an extreme step. And yet, that was exactly what they were planning. The day before the departure, humans gathered their records, prepared communications, and reviewed their plan one last time. They double-checked everything, ensuring that their actions would be clear and undeniable. They were not leaving out of anger or revenge. They were leaving to send a message. By the time other civilizations realized what had happened, humans wanted the council to fully understand their absence. It was a careful, deliberate decision, executed with a level of precision that only humans could achieve. As the council adjourned that evening, humans made their final preparations. Some quietly packed their tools, data, and resources. Others ensured that communication channels would reflect their departure clearly. They spoke among themselves in low voices, calm and focused, fully aware of the weight of their decision. The universe around them continued in its usual rhythm, unaware of the storm that was about to break. When the council convened the next day, humans did not appear. There were no announcements, no warnings, no messages. Chairs remained empty, and screens displayed silence where human voices had always been present. For a moment, confusion reigned. Some council members assumed it was a technical issue, while others thought it might be a minor protest. But as hours passed and humans failed to respond, the reality became undeniable. Humans had walked out. The calm that had dominated the council's halls for centuries was shattered, replaced by uncertainty, tension, and the first sparks of panic that the human departure was quiet, yet impossible to ignore. Other civilizations began to feel the absence immediately. Tasks humans had managed efficiently fell behind schedule. Negotiations humans had guided started to falter. The council, which had once assumed humans were just another species, suddenly realized how much they had relied on their insight, their dedication, and their ability to act decisively when needed. The consequences of ignoring human voices became clear almost instantly, and a wave of anxiety began to ripple through the chambers. And in that moment, humans watched from afar, not with hostility, but with quiet determination. They had made their choice, and it was deliberate. They wanted the council to understand that their presence was not optional. They wanted the galaxy to see that fairness, honesty, and courage could not be ignored indefinitely. The first step had been taken, and the stage was set for the events that would follow. The calm before the storm had ended, and the real test of the Council's wisdom and humility was about to begin. The day humans walked out, the Council's chambers were thrown into confusion. At first, many assumed it was a technical mistake. Holographic seats sat empty, consoles blinked without input, and screens that usually displayed human representatives were blank. Some council members whispered to one another, trying to make sense of it. "Perhaps it's a system error," one said. "It must be delayed," another suggested. But as minutes stretched into hours, doubt crept in. Humans had never missed a meeting without prior warning. Their absence was deliberate, and for the first time, the council felt the weight of that realization. Panic began to spread quietly at first. The smaller civilizations started worrying about the immediate impact. Humans had been the mediators, the problem solvers, and the ones who often saw solutions others couldn't. Without their presence, minor disagreements escalated rapidly. Trade disputes that humans had previously handled calmly started turning into full-blown arguments. Supplies that humans had monitored carefully were now being mismanaged. Some council members scrambled to fill the gap, but nothing seemed to work as efficiently. It was as if the entire system had relied on the humans' presence more than anyone had realized. Attempts to contact the humans were immediate. Messages were sent through every available channel, encrypted communications, interstellar signals, even personal envoys. Yet all efforts were met with silence. There was no anger, no threats, no demands, only quiet, deliberate absence. The humans were sending a message, and it was clear they were not going to participate until their concerns were truly heard. This silence was louder than any protest could have been. For the first time, council members understood that human actions were never random. Every step they took was intentional, calculated, and meaningful. As the day progressed, the sense of panic began to grow. The council had always assumed humans would conform to tradition, follow protocols, and participate quietly. No one had imagined that humans would walk away entirely. This realization hit hard. Members began to question their own decisions, wondering what they might have missed or overlooked. Every past interaction was scrutinized. Every time humans had suggested improvements that were ignored came back to haunt them. The council slowly recognized that humans had always been more than just participants. They had been a cornerstone of stability. Meanwhile, humans observed from a distance. They watched the council scramble, noting how quickly the balance they had helped maintain began to falter. There was no joy in their eyes, only clarity. They were making a point, showing what happened when voices were ignored, when fairness was dismissed, and when decisions were made without consideration of all perspectives. They knew this action would cause discomfort, perhaps even fear, but that was necessary. For change to occur, the council needed to see the consequences firsthand. Small incidents began multiplying across the galaxy. Trade convoys that humans had carefully coordinated collided or were delayed, creating shortages on planets that relied on them. Diplomatic discussions stalled without humans to mediate, and misunderstandings between civilizations escalated into arguments that could have been avoided. Every council member began to feel the absence keenly. The humans were not just missing, they were creating a vacuum that the council could not fill, highlighting how integral they had been to the smooth functioning of galactic affairs. The council tried to take immediate action. They held emergency meetings, reassigned tasks, and attempted to manage crises without human input. Yet every solution they attempted seemed temporary, insufficient, or ineffective. The human approach to problem solving was unique, grounded in observation, logic, and empathy. No other civilization seemed able to replicate it fully. Council members began to realize that they had underestimated humans' influence, assuming their absence would create only minor disruptions. Instead, The disruption was profound, affecting every corner of the galaxy and forcing the Council to confront its own complacency. Amid the growing panic, arguments erupted among Council members themselves. Some blamed each other, accusing rival civilizations of provoking the humans' departure. Others argued that humans had overreacted, claiming that their absence was unreasonable. These disputes distracted the Council from addressing the real issues, worsening the situation. The more the Council argued among themselves, the more obvious it became the humans had been a stabilizing force. Their departure revealed weaknesses that no one had noticed before. Weaknesses that humans had been quietly compensating for all along. Envoys were dispatched to find human representatives, traveling across star systems, visiting remote colonies, and scanning communications channels for any sign of their presence. The searches revealed meticulous planning. Humans had intentionally left no trace, no loopholes, no way for the Council to claim ignorance. It was a coordinated withdrawal, designed to be unmistakable. Every step humans had taken was deliberate, sending a message that was impossible to ignore. If you fail to listen, there are consequences. The envoys reported back, astonished not only by the humans' discipline, but by the quiet authority of their decision. While the Council continued to panic, humans maintained a calm, almost serene distance. They were not acting out of anger or revenge. Their goal was not to punish, but to educate. By stepping away, they forced the Council to face reality. The galaxy, once thought to be orderly and predictable, now revealed its fragility. The humans' absence exposed cracks in systems that had seemed flawless. They showed that real leadership was not just about holding a title or occupying a seat. It was about presence, action, and accountability. As hours turned into days, the Council's panic grew more intense. Minor issues became major crises. Messages and resources were delayed. Planets that had relied on human coordination found themselves in confusion. The Council had to make difficult decisions without the humans' insight. Mistakes were made, agreements faltered, and the sense of order that had seemed permanent now felt precarious. Every Council member, regardless of species or rank, began to realize the depth of the mistake they had made by ignoring human voices. The humans observed quietly, knowing that time was part of their strategy. They understood that the Council needed to feel the absence fully, to experience the consequences of inaction and indifference. This was not a temporary experiment. It was a lesson that could not be learned in minutes or hours. The humans' patience mirrored their intelligence. They waited, calculated, and remained focused on the bigger goal. By showing the Council what happened without them, they were forcing change without confrontation. Some Council members began reflecting on past interactions with humans. They recalled meetings where humans had suggested fairer systems, where they had prevented disputes from escalating, and where they had guided negotiations that otherwise might have failed. These memories now carried weight. The Council began to see that human insight had always been critical, not because humans were powerful, but because they approached problems differently. Humans combined logic with empathy, strategy with fairness, and observation with decisive action. These qualities could not be replicated or replaced by any other civilization. As the crisis continued, Council members started questioning themselves more deeply. Why had they ignored warnings? Why had they dismissed practical suggestions? How had they underestimated the humans' importance? These questions had no easy answers. For the first time, the Council faced not only the practical challenges of humans' absence, but the moral and strategic lessons it brought. The panic was not only about logistics, it was about understanding the consequences of underestimating those who challenged the status quo. Humans remained distant, yet attentive. They did not intervene or interfere. Their absence alone was enough to demonstrate their point. By choosing silence over argument, withdrawal over confrontation, humans had turned the Council's panic into a mirror reflecting its own failures. They had taken control without force, proving that presence, integrity, and insight could influence entire civilizations in ways that power or authority alone never could. By the end of the second day, the council realized that the humans' absence was not temporary. Their walkout was deliberate, calculated, and irreversible unless the council acted differently. The panic reached its peak. Members were scrambling to address crisis they did not fully understand, trying to implement solutions that lacked human perspective. Yet, despite the chaos, humans remained calm, observing, learning, and waiting. Their actions had already begun to reshape the council's perception of leadership, influence, and responsibility. In those quiet hours, it became clear humans had not just walked out, they had made a statement that would resonate across the galaxy. They had shown that one species' absence could reveal flaws in even the most powerful systems. They had demonstrated the importance of fairness, communication, and respect. And they had reminded everyone that leadership was not about holding power, but about using it wisely, thoughtfully, and ethically. The council's panic was not just fear, it was recognition, a dawning understanding that humans had been indispensable all along. And so, as the day ended and darkness spread across distant worlds, the council faced a simple, undeniable truth. Without humans, the galaxy was no longer stable, no longer predictable, and no longer certain. The council's panic had grown from a subtle tension to a full-blown crisis. Every representative felt it in their core. Meetings that once flowed smoothly were now filled with shouting, interruptions, and endless accusations. Small disagreements turned into heated arguments, and old rivalries resurfaced. The absence of humans was no longer just noticed, it was deeply felt. They had been the ones who could calm tempers, mediate disputes, and keep discussions on track. Without them, the council seemed to spin out of control. At first, council members tried to deny the depth of the problem. They reassured themselves that humans would return eventually, that perhaps this was a protest lasting only a few hours or a day. But as days passed, the absence became undeniable. Important decisions were delayed, trade routes faltered, and resources were mismanaged. Humans had been the ones who noticed the small details, the tiny imbalances that could grow into massive issues. Now, without their careful attention, small problems were becoming critical, and council members were feeling the pressure. Diplomatic talks that had been progressing steadily began to stall. Planets that humans had been mediating were now in disagreement, unable to reach compromises without their guidance. Discussions that had once been simple were now prolonged, tense, and often fruitless. The humans had always had a way of speaking directly to the heart of a matter, cutting through politics, pride, and confusion. Their absence revealed just how reliant the galaxy had become on their insight. Council members began to realize that humans were not merely participants, they were the glue that held many processes together. Attempts to manage the situation without humans failed repeatedly. Council members tried to assign humans responsibilities to others, but no one could replicate their skill, patience, and clarity. Decisions were rushed or ignored, mistakes multiplied, and the galaxy's delicate balance began to shift. Each failed attempt increased the council's panic, creating a cycle of fear and urgency that only grew worse with time. Humans had designed their withdrawal carefully. It was deliberate and silent, and it forced every member of the council to face the consequences of ignoring them. The panic spread beyond the council chambers. Civilizations throughout the galaxy began to notice that things were not as they should be. Supply chains faltered, diplomatic agreements slowed, and minor conflicts began to escalate. Leaders on distant planets expressed concern over delays and miscommunication, wondering why humans were no longer participating in galactic affairs. Their absence was felt in every corner of the galaxy. Humans had been quietly indispensable, and now their departure was making the consequences visible. Within the council, arguments intensified. Some representatives accused others of failing to recognize humans' contributions. Others suggested that the humans had overreacted and that the council should continue as if nothing had happened. But no one could deny the truth. Without humans, systems that had once functioned efficiently were now struggling. The council's structure, which had always appeared strong and orderly, was showing cracks that had previously been hidden by human oversight and intervention. Envoys sent to contact. Humans returned with reports of meticulous planning. Humans had left no mistakes, no gaps, no signals that could be misinterpreted. Every action they had taken was precise and deliberate. Their walkout was not random or impulsive, was carefully calculated to show the council the consequences of neglect and inattention. Council members listened in disbelief. They had underestimated humans' determination, their patience, and their intelligence. For a species often underestimated, humans had made an undeniable statement. In observing the chaos their absence caused, humans remained calm and collected. They did not celebrate the council's panic or take satisfaction in the disorder that followed. Instead, they watched carefully, noting the patterns of mistakes, the struggles of leaders, and the way in which order faltered without their guidance. Their goal was not punishment, but awareness. They wanted the council to see clearly what happened when their voices were ignored and their concerns dismissed. Every failure, every mismanaged project, every delay was a lesson the council needed to learn. The council's panic was compounded by internal reflection. Members began to remember moments when humans had offered advice, solutions, or warnings that had been ignored. They recalled situations where humans had prevented disputes from escalating or had guided negotiations that might have failed without their insight. The absence of humans brought those moments into sharp focus. Every decision to overlook human input now seemed like a missed opportunity. Council members began to understand that humans' contributions had been subtle but profound, often shaping outcomes without anyone fully appreciating it at the time. As the days passed, the panic evolved into desperation. The council realized that humans' absence was creating long-term consequences. Systems were breaking down, diplomatic relations were strained, and the smooth functioning of the galaxy was at risk. Council members started to question themselves more deeply than ever before. How had they failed to see the importance of human input? Why had they dismissed concerns that now seemed so critical? They began to understand that their panic was not only about immediate disruption, but also about the recognition that humans had been irreplaceable. Temps. To compensate for humans' absence only highlighted the gap further. Tasks were reassigned, additional resources were deployed, and emergency measures were implemented, but nothing could fully replicate the human's ability to anticipate problems and address them efficiently. Mistakes that humans would have prevented were now commonplace. Every misstep reminded the council of what they had lost and why humans had walked out in the first place. The council was forced to confront its own limitations in a way it had never experienced before. Despite the chaos, humans maintained a quiet presence from afar. They observed the council's attempts to fix problems, noting what worked, what failed, and how the absence of their insight affected outcomes. Their withdrawal was a lesson in itself, a demonstration that leadership and responsibility were not about authority alone, but about understanding, action, and accountability. Humans had always acted not for recognition, but for results, and their absence highlighted just how much the council had relied on their dedication. By the third day, the panic had reached a new level. Council members began holding emergency summits, trying to tackle the crises created by the humans' absence. Every decision felt heavier, every debate longer, and every outcome less certain. The humans' departure had transformed the council from a body of confident decision-makers into a group forced to confront its own inadequacies. Panic was no longer just a feeling. It had become a tangible force, shaping every action, every thought, and every conversation within the council. Leaders on distant planets were now openly expressing concern. Trade negotiations stalled, essential supplies were delayed, and smaller civilizations began to feel vulnerable. Without humans mediating conflicts and managing systems, even minor disagreements threatened to spiral out of control. The Council's panic was mirrored across the galaxy, as the absence of a single species revealed just how much balance had depended on their participation. Humans had always acted as both problem solvers and stabilizers, and now the galaxy felt the absence in every corner. Amid the growing panic, some council members began to reflect more deeply. They realized that humans had always combined intelligence with empathy, strategy with morality, and observation with decisive action. No other civilization had approached problems the same way. Humans had a rare ability to see the bigger picture without losing sight of the smallest details. Their absence was a stark reminder that leadership was not just about authority or titles, it was about insight, presence, and the ability to act when it mattered most. The Council's reflection did little to slow the immediate chaos, but it laid the groundwork for understanding. They began to recognize the humans' influence, not just as participants, but as catalysts for order, fairness, and efficiency. Their absence was not merely a logistical challenge, it was a profound lesson in respect, value, and the consequences of neglect. The humans had walked out to show, in the clearest possible way, that their presence mattered, and the Council was finally beginning to see the truth dot as the day drew to a close. The Council faced an uncomfortable reality. Humans had walked out deliberately, and their absence had revealed weaknesses that could no longer be ignored. Panic had forced members to confront not only immediate problems, but also long-standing issues that had been overlooked. The Council was learning, in real time, the consequences of underestimating a species that had always acted with intelligence, integrity, and foresight. Humans were not gone because they wanted to harm anyone. They had left to teach a lesson that the Council would not forget. From their distant vantage point, humans watched quietly. They did not intervene, did not scold, and did not celebrate. Their calm observation was a reminder that true influence came not from force or authority, but from action, integrity, and the willingness to step back when necessary. The Council's panic had achieved its purpose. It had revealed the critical importance of human participation and the consequences of ignoring voices that matter. And so, as the third day ended and darkness settled, the Council had reached a breaking point. Days had passed since the humans had walked out, and the chaos they had left behind was becoming impossible to ignore. Trade routes were tangled, diplomatic talks were stalled, and smaller civilizations were struggling to manage resources that had once flowed smoothly. Panic had settled into a constant heavy weight, pressing down on every member of the Council. Meetings lasted longer than ever, but decisions were slower and less effective. Every Council member began to realize that the humans' absence was not just inconvenient, it was destabilizing the entire galaxy. The first step the Council took was to try to understand why humans had left. Messages were sent across communication networks, envoys were dispatched to every corner of known space, and private investigations were conducted into every action humans had taken before their departure. What they discovered was astonishing. Humans had not left by accident. There were no gaps, no missteps, no oversight that could explain their absence. Every decision, every action, every piece of preparation had been deliberate. Humans had withdrawn with purpose, and the Council had no choice but to confront the reality of what they had done. Some Council members resisted admitting this truth. They wanted to believe that humans were merely protesting, that their absence would be temporary, or that their departure was an overreaction. But the evidence was overwhelming. Communications had been deliberately sealed, resources withdrawn methodically, and all trace of human oversight removed from ongoing projects. Humans were sending a clear message. They would not return until the Council recognized the consequences of ignoring their concerns. The more the council tried to argue otherwise, the more obvious it became that humans were in full control of the situation. The council began to send teams to locate human representatives directly. These envoys traveled across star systems, visiting remote colonies, research stations, and communication hubs. Everywhere they went, they found the same pattern. Humans had left no trace, no loopholes, and no room for misinterpretation. Their absence was absolute, and the precision of their planning left no doubt that this was intentional. Envoys returned with reports filled with astonishment and respect. Humans had acted not out of anger, but out of a clear sense of purpose. They had withdrawn to show the council what happened when voices were ignored and concerns were dismissed. As the council examined the consequences of human absence, it became painfully clear how dependent the galaxy had become on them. Systems the humans had once managed seamlessly were now in chaos. Trade convoys had collided or been delayed, causing shortages on planets that had relied on them. Negotiations that humans had guided were now stalled indefinitely, and smaller civilizations were beginning to feel abandoned. Without humans, even the most experienced council members struggled to maintain order. Every problem seemed bigger, every solution slower, and every outcome less certain. Humans had been quietly indispensable. The more the council tried to solve problems without humans, the more they realized the depth of the humans' foresight. Humans had not just been effective because of intelligence. They had been effective because of empathy, foresight, and the ability to anticipate consequences before they occurred. They had understood how different civilizations thought, how disputes escalated, and how to find solutions that respected everyone involved. Now, with humans gone, the council struggled to replicate these skills. Every action taken without them only highlighted their absence. Further, envoys returned from their searches with stories that confirmed what the council had already begun to understand. Humans had withdrawn strategically, making sure that every system affected by their absence was impacted in a way that could not be ignored. There was no chaos for its own sake. Every disruption was a lesson, a demonstration of the importance of their presence. The council began to realize that humans were teaching them something fundamental, that leadership and responsibility were not about power alone, but about insight, action, and respect for those whose voices mattered. Some council members began to reflect on their past interactions with humans. They recalled meetings where humans had suggested solutions that had been ignored, instances when disputes had escalated because their warnings were dismissed, and moments when their guidance had prevented crises. Every memory now carried new weight. The council realized that humans had not simply participated. They had stabilized systems, guided negotiations, and prevented conflicts that could have spiraled out of control. Their departure was not just an absence. It was a revelation of their true influence. While the council struggled to understand humans, the humans themselves remained calm. They did not intervene directly. They did not send messages or attempt to justify their actions. Their silence was deliberate. By stepping back, they allowed the council to face the consequences of inaction and negligence on its own. Humans understood that real lessons were learned through experience, not argument. By withdrawing, they forced the council to confront not only the practical consequences of their absence, but also the moral and ethical implications of ignoring voices that had always acted with integrity and insight. Council members tried every approach they could think of to attract the humans' attention. They sent formal letters, appeals for dialogue, and personal envoys. Yet every effort was met with quiet resistance. Humans had not blocked communication out of spite. They had simply created space for the council to see the impact of its decisions. Their absence was teaching patience, humility, and awareness. Every day without humans revealed more about the council's reliance on them and the lie. mistakes that had been made by taking them for granted. As the crisis continued, the council began to feel something deeper than panic. It was shame. They recognized that humans had been offering solutions, guidance, and insight that were consistently overlooked. The more they reflected, the more they understood that this was not a rebellion. It was a wake-up call. Humans had acted not with anger, but with purpose. They were holding up a mirror to the council, showing them how much they had underestimated the intelligence, patience, and influence of a species they had assumed would always conform. The council also began to notice the wider impact of humans' absence. Small civilizations, which had always relied on human mediation, now found themselves vulnerable. Conflicts that could have been easily prevented were beginning to escalate. Trade networks were disrupted, causing shortages of essential resources on many planets. Political negotiations, once guided by human wisdom, faltered and stalled. The council began to understand that humans had not only been essential internally, within the chambers, but had also been the invisible thread holding the galaxy together externally. Their departure was a lesson in interconnectedness, responsibility, and the importance of listening to those who contribute silently, but significantly. Some members of the council began to speak openly about the humans' value. They argued that the council had failed by dismissing concerns too easily, that previous mistakes had gone uncorrected, and that humans had been essential in preventing disaster without anyone noticing. Others, still defensive, resisted this acknowledgement, claiming that humans had acted too drastically. Yet, even the most resistant members could not deny the evidence. Systems were failing, agreements were stalling, and the consequences of neglect were undeniable. The humans' absence had spoken louder than any words could. Envoys continued their search. Reporting back with more evidence of human strategic withdrawal. They found empty stations, sealed communication hubs, and carefully maintained systems that had been deliberately left without interference. It became clear that humans had planned their walkout with precision, knowing exactly which areas would feel the absence most acutely. Every mismanaged system, every delayed negotiation, and every disrupted supply chain was a lesson carefully orchestrated to teach the council the importance of listening, valuing and respecting contributions. As the council absorbed these lessons, a gradual shift began to occur. Panic was still present, but it was now accompanied by reflection and understanding. Members realized that the humans' departure had been necessary, that it had revealed weaknesses and flaws that could no longer be ignored. The council began to acknowledge that humans had been indispensable, not because of force or authority, but because of their insight, empathy, and ability to act decisively when it mattered most. By the end of the fourth day, the council was preparing to change its approach. Discussions began about how to reach humans, how to restore communication, and how to ensure their concerns were genuinely heard. Humans had created a situation where return was possible only if the council acted differently, only if it acknowledged the mistakes of the past and approached humans with respect and understanding. The lesson was clear. Humans would not simply resume participation on demand. They would return when their value was recognized and their voice was respected. From their distant vantage point, humans observed quietly, noting the council's reflection, their attempts to adapt, and the slow recognition of the lessons embedded in their absence. They had not left to punish or dominate. They had left to teach, to reveal, and to create space for understanding. Their calm, deliberate withdrawal had achieved its purpose. The council was. As the days stretched on, the council began to reflect more deeply than ever before. The chaos created by the humans' absence was impossible to ignore. Trade convoys continued to falter, negotiations stalled, and smaller civilizations were increasingly frustrated. Council members had tried to manage the crisis with their usual methods, but nothing seemed to work as effectively as humans had. Slowly, an uncomfortable realization spread through the chambers. Humans had not been ordinary participants. They had been the unseen force that held the system together. Their presence had been quiet, almost invisible, but essential DOT members began to recall past interactions, moments that had once seemed minor or routine. There had been times when humans had suggested practical solutions that were dismissed or overlooked. They had mediated disputes between civilizations that otherwise would have escalated, offering compromises that satisfied all sides. They had noticed details that others missed, anticipating consequences before anyone else could. Looking back now, it was clear that humans had always contributed far more than their seat in the council implied. Every problem solved, every agreement reached, every conflict avoided had been strengthened by human insight. The more the council reflected, the more apparent the human influence became. Decisions that had seemed simple often relied on subtle guidance from humans. Trade routes that ran smoothly, diplomatic talks that reached compromise, and resources that were carefully balanced had all been maintained in large part by humans' thoughtful involvement. Without them, these systems were faltering rapidly. Council members could no longer deny that humans had been indispensable. Their absence was a stark reminder that intelligence combined with empathy and foresight could not be replicated easily. This realization was humbling. Council members who had previously dismissed human concerns were forced to confront their own mistakes. They had underestimated humans' patience, their intelligence, and their ability to act decisively when it mattered. They had assumed that humans would always participate, always comply, and always accept dismissal politely. That assumption had been completely wrong. Humans had walked away not out of anger or pride, but because they recognized the importance of their voice and the consequences of ignoring it. The council had been given a lesson in humility, and it was one they could not ignore. As council members reflected, they also began to notice the subtle ways humans had shaped intergalactic governance. Humans had not simply solved problems, they had inspired new ways of thinking. Their questions had challenged assumptions. Their solutions had encouraged cooperation, and their actions had often prevented the council from falling into complacency. Without humans, the weaknesses of the council's structure became obvious. Small oversights now spiraled into larger issues. Disputes that humans would have calmed were escalating. Mistakes that would have been caught early were now causing real consequences. Every misstep underscored the human's value. Some council members began to discuss this openly. They admitted that they had taken humans for granted, assuming that their contributions were replaceable or unimportant. Others still resisted, clinging to old habits and old prejudices. Yet even the skeptics could not escape the evidence. The galaxy itself was feeling the absence of humans. Trade networks were disrupted, resource shortages were increasing, and diplomatic relations were straining. The humans' withdrawal had turned abstract concepts of importance and value into immediate, tangible problems. Their absence was impossible to ignore. Envoys continued to gather information about humans' positions and actions during their absence. What they discovered impressed even the most doubtful council members. Humans had left systems in a state that highlighted the council's reliance on them, yet without causing permanent harm. The disruptions were noticeable, but not catastrophic, demonstrating precision, patience, and careful planning. Humans had made their point clearly. They were essential, and their absence needed to be acknowledged. Every report returned to the council reinforced the same lesson: humans were irreplaceable not because of force or authority, but because of insight, foresight, and moral integrity. Reflection also revealed the broader human impact on intergalactic relationships. Small civilizations that had once struggled to have their voices heard now found themselves without human advocacy. Disputes that humans would have mediated escalated, and negotiations that humans would have guided stalled or broke down entirely. The council realized that humans had not only been essential internally, in the chambers themselves, but also externally, in the way their influence maintained stability across countless civilizations. Their absence had exposed a network of reliance that no one had fully appreciated until now. The Council began to admit the depth of their errors. They had ignored suggestions that were practical and fair. They had dismissed concerns that were valid and well-reasoned. They had assumed that humans would always conform, always follow rules, and always accept compromise even when the Council acted unjustly. That assumption had been a mistake of epic proportions. Humans had walked out to demonstrate not anger, but the consequences of neglect. They had left to teach a lesson the Council would remember for generations. While panic had initially dominated, reflection now took hold. Council members began asking themselves how they could correct their past mistakes. How could they restore the systems humans had maintained? How could they ensure that humans' voices were heard and respected in the future? These questions were challenging, but they were necessary. The humans' absence had forced the Council to examine itself in ways it had never done before. It was no longer a matter of efficiency. It was a matter of principle, responsibility, and fairness. As discussions continued, some Council members proposed reaching out to humans in new ways. Not through demands or formal orders, but through understanding, respect, and acknowledgement of past mistakes. They recognized that humans had the power to restore balance, but only if the Council approached them with humility and sincerity. This shift in perspective was a turning point. Humans had not merely left, they had created an opportunity for the Council to learn, grow, and change. Their absence was a lesson in leadership, empathy, and the true value of collaboration. Meanwhile, humans continued to observe quietly. They did not demand apologies or immediate compliance. They waited patiently, knowing that the Council would only learn the lesson fully if it experienced the consequences of their absence. Humans understood that change imposed from outside was temporary. True change came from understanding and self-reflection. By remaining distant, they allowed the Council to reflect, to recognize errors, and to see their own reliance on human presence and wisdom. As reflection deepened, Council members also began to see the long-term implications of humans' contributions. Humans had not only solved immediate problems, but had also created systems that encouraged fairness, stability, and cooperation. They had challenged the Council to think differently, to anticipate problems, and to act ethically. Without humans, these lessons were no longer applied, and the consequences were visible everywhere. The Council began to understand that humans had been shaping the galaxy in ways both subtle and profound. Their absence was not punishment, it was revelation. Through reflection, discussion, and careful observation, the Council began to adjust. They started prioritizing fairness, paying closer attention to the needs of smaller civilizations, and attempting to manage conflicts with the patience humans had once shown. Every effort made to emulate human foresight highlighted how difficult it was to match their ability to combine logic, empathy, and decisive action. Humans had not just contributed, they had elevated the entire system. Their absence was teaching the Council humility, patience, and a deeper understanding of true leadership. By the fifth day, the Council had reached a critical realization. Humans were not simply participants, they were indispensable leaders, whose absence revealed the full extent of the Council's dependency. Their walkout was a statement of accountability, a demonstration that fairness and insight could not be ignored indefinitely. Council members began to accept that restoring balance would require more than emergency measures. It would require recognition, respect, and a fundamental change in how humans were treated. The reflection also reached individual Council members. Some admitted personal mistakes, recalling instances when they had ignored human advice, dismissed concerns, or undervalued their contributions. Others recognized systemic errors, understanding that the Council itself had created an environment where human voices were often overlooked. These admissions were uncomfortable, but necessary. Humans had not left to punish. They had left to reveal truths that the council needed to face as the day ended. A new understanding began to take root. Panic had transformed into awareness, frustration into reflection, and chaos into insight. Council members now understood that humans' absence was not just a disruption. It was a lesson in integrity, foresight, and the value of every voice in a system that claimed to represent all. Humans had demonstrated, with precision and patience, the importance of respect, recognition, and collaboration. The council had finally begun to internalize the lesson. From their distant observation points, humans remained calm and composed. They watched as the fall. The council had spent days in reflection, discussion, and careful observation, and by the sixth day, a shift had begun. Panic had lessened slightly, replaced by a cautious determination. Members realized that continuing as they had before was impossible. Systems were still faltering, trade networks were still disrupted, and smaller civilizations were still struggling. The consequences of humans' absence were everywhere, clear and undeniable. The council knew it was time to act, but not in the same old ways. This time, they had to approach humans with understanding, respect, and sincerity. Plans were drafted for direct communication. Council members debated the approach carefully. No one wanted to seem desperate, yet everyone understood the importance of acknowledging past mistakes. They decided that messages should not demand a return, nor should they make excuses. Instead, they would recognize the humans' contributions, admit the oversight, and request dialogue. Every word was chosen deliberately. Humans had demonstrated patience and precision in their withdrawal, and the council now realized that their approach would need to reflect the same care. Envoys were chosen to deliver the message. They were among the most respected members of the council, individuals known for fairness, patience, and integrity. Their task was not simply to request humans' return, but to show genuine understanding of the lesson humans had imparted. As they prepared to depart, each envoy reviewed the sequence of events over the past days. They considered every disrupted system, every stalled negotiation, and every instance where humans' guidance had been invaluable. Their goal was to communicate awareness, humility, and respect, qualities humans had always demanded and now rightfully deserved. Meanwhile, humans observed from a distance, calm and watchful. They had not needed to intervene directly during the council's reflection. The problems, delays, and challenges had been enough to demonstrate the point. Yet now, for the first time since their withdrawal, humans were attentive to the council's response. They noted the careful preparation of messages, the choice of envoys, and the tone of each communication. The humans' patience was remarkable. They had given the council ample time to reflect and act responsibly. Their absence had been a lesson, and now the council's actions would determine whether it had been learned fully. As the envoys traveled to meet the humans, the council waited anxiously. Every member understood that this encounter would be pivotal. Humans had demonstrated intelligence, foresight, and moral clarity in their withdrawal. The council knew that returning to business as usual was impossible without acknowledging these qualities. They had learned that the humans' value went far beyond simple participation. Humans had shaped systems, prevented conflicts, and maintained balance in ways that others could not. This meeting was not just about restoring order. It was about demonstrating genuine understanding and respect. The first interaction between the envoys and the humans was quiet, measured, and deliberate. Humans did not speak immediately. They listened, observed, and assessed the council's representatives. Their silence was not cold, it was deliberate, a test of sincerity. The council's envoys spoke carefully, admitting past mistakes, recognizing the humans' contributions, and explaining the disruptions caused by their absence. They did not make excuses, demand cooperation, or promise immediate solutions. Instead, they focused on acknowledgement, respect, and a desire to rebuild trust. Humans responded with calm clarity. They spoke not with anger, but with reason. They explained why their departure had been necessary, emphasizing the importance of respect, accountability, and attentive participation. They reminded the council that their actions had consequences, both immediate and long-term, and that the lessons of the past days could not be ignored. Their words were measured, thoughtful, and firm. The council listened closely, understanding for the first time the full depth of what humans had contributed and why their absence had caused such disruption. The conversation deepened as the humans outlined the principles that guided their actions. They emphasized foresight, empathy, and accountability. They explained how they had anticipated issues before they arose, mediated conflicts before they escalated, and ensured fairness in systems that others had taken for granted. The council realized that humans had not merely participated, they had elevated the council itself. Every mistake, every delay, and every conflict during their absence highlighted how essential their insight had been. As the dialogue continued, council members began to admit errors openly. They recounted instances where they had ignored warnings, dismissed concerns, and underestimated human intelligence. They acknowledged that their assumptions about compliance and patience had been wrong. Humans had walked away not out of arrogance, but to teach a lesson about responsibility, value, and respect. The council's willingness to recognize these mistakes was the first step toward restoring balance and trust. Humans responded with a quiet approval that was almost imperceptible but deeply felt. Their patience had not been passive. It had been intentional. They had waited for the council to reach a point of genuine reflection. Now, seeing acknowledgement and sincerity, they allowed dialogue to continue, offering guidance, sharing insights, and outlining ways the council could prevent similar oversights in the future. The human's presence was once again stabilizing the systems, not through force, but through shared understanding and collaboration. The council quickly recognized that restoring order would require more than temporary fixes. They needed to integrate human principles into governance permanently. They began discussing ways to implement new systems, protocols, and communication methods that would ensure that human input was valued and respected in every decision. The focus shifted from crisis management to long-term improvement. Humans were not returning simply to participate, they were returning to guide, advise, and shape the council in ways that would prevent future disruption. Small civilizations began to notice the effects immediately. Trade routes stabilized, diplomatic negotiations resumed, and disputes that had escalated during the humans' absence were resolved. Systems that had faltered began to function smoothly again. It became clear that humans' influence was not just symbolic, it was practical, tangible, and essential. The Council's recognition of this fact transformed both the chamber itself and the broader galaxy. Humans were not merely representatives. They were leaders, visionaries, and stabilizers whose presence ensured fairness and efficiency across civilizations. Throughout the process, the Council maintained a focus on respect and acknowledgement. No one attempted to assert dominance, demand compliance, or bypass human insight. Instead, the focus was on listening, understanding, and collaborating. This approach, once considered unnecessary, now proved essential. Humans had always acted from principle, not for recognition or reward. Their wisdom, patience, and foresight had guided the galaxy for years without fanfare. Now, the Council was learning the importance of valuing these qualities explicitly. As days passed, dialogue between humans and the Council deepened. The humans offered insights not only on immediate issues, but also on long-term governance, fairness, and interstellar cooperation. They highlighted potential weaknesses, suggested preventive measures, and shared strategies for maintaining balance across civilizations. The Council listened attentively, understanding that the humans' return was not just about restoring order. It was about learning how to govern more effectively, ethically, and INCL-USIV ELY. Council members began implementing the changes recommended by humans. Communication channels were streamlined, decision-making protocols were adjusted, and mechanisms for dispute resolution were improved. The humans' guidance transformed the Council's approach, fostering collaboration, transparency, and accountability. Systems that had faltered during their absence became stronger and more resilient. Every action reinforced the lesson humans had imparted: intelligence combined with empathy. Foresight and accountability was irreplaceable. Humans remained calm, patient, and observant throughout the process. They did not take credit, did not demand authority, and did not impose themselves. Their presence was stabilizing, educational, and guiding. By returning only after acknowledgement, reflection, and sincere effort, they reinforced the principle that respect, value, and insight must be recognized and appreciated. The Council now fully understood that their absence had been a lesson, and their return was the beginning of a new era of cooperation and understanding. By the end of the 6th day, the Council had transformed. Panic had been replaced by awareness, disorder by stability, and uncertainty by collaboration. Humans had demonstrated the power of presence, insight, and principled action. Their careful withdrawal and thoughtful return had reshaped not only Council operations, but also the understanding of leadership across the galaxy. Council members now recognized that humans were indispensable, not through force or domination, but through wisdom, fairness, and the ability to guide systems with clarity and empathy. The humans' actions had achieved what no amount of argument, negotiation, or authority could. They had taught a lesson through absence and returned to guide through insight. Their patience, foresight, and moral clarity had reshaped the Council's understanding of responsibility, leadership, and the value of voices that are often